Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know it's kind of rainy and all. How many people here have heard of the impending tuition increases at CCSU? How many have heard of the upcoming demonstrations on March 11th and March 21st? Well, okay. Well, if this meeting does one thing, we'll get more folks informed about that. What's really interesting about these increases is not only are they increasing tuition like they've done pretty much every year that I can remember as long as I've been in Connecticut, but they're also cutting money going to CCSU in addition to that. They're not increasing tuition to make it to increase services on campus. But one of the things that I think is very fascinating about this is that at the same time that tuition is increasing across the country, the technology to distribute information is more plentiful than ever and is often cheaper than ever. And at the same time, there are fewer jobs. So it's not like, and there are especially fewer jobs that need education. So to try to explain this by some kind of supply and demand thing where there's more jobs that need a college education and you get a lot of money if you put in that $100,000 or that $30,000 into your school, that's not there at all. There are fewer jobs. It's one of the many fantastic contradictions that we're experiencing right now in this society, among others of which include the fact that everything we use is produced all over the world. It's produced socially. There's probably not a single thing you own or have used at work that is not produced at least in part in one other country, if not many, many other countries. And yet we still live under different national borders. We still go to war with many other countries. The U.S. is drone bombing many other countries right now. And one of the most fantastic contradictions right now that I think is starting to really sink in and people are mobilizing around is the enormous, not just single ecological crisis, but multiple ecological crises. And these crises, like climate change, are not only on a larger scale than human beings have ever experienced in any society before, but they're also experienced by people who have probably a greater understanding of the ecological destruction that is being created than any prior society. Other societies cause ecological damage, but they didn't have, enormous, nearly the level of systematized knowledge and generalized knowledge of nature. Often in the environmental movement, we focus in on, how much people don't understand about climate change in this country. And that's changed, especially because of the recent storms. But in Europe, they've known about climate change as a general population, other countries around the world, for many years. And those countries are not getting any better. Not only are they not reducing carbon emissions, we are now getting into a stage where extraction companies are engaging in enormously hazardous extraction processes, like fracking, the tar sands removal that there was just a major demonstration against on February 17th. These kind of extraction policies, methods, they get into the groundwater, they destroy the ecology of surrounding communities, they create often more greenhouse gas emissions than the prior fuels that were extracted, if only because the method itself is so destructive. So these are some of the things I'd like to talk about today, and I'm going to get more in depth in actually why this is going on. There's a lot of different ideas about why this is happening that will not lead us anywhere towards solving the problems.
Microphone? Do you have a microphone?
Nope. There's no microphone. No. Can everyone hear me?
Can't see you though.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So first off, I want to talk about President Obama is talking about now possibly increasing minimum wage to about $9 an hour. And so a lot of people are getting excited about this. There's major demonstrations and so on. Now increasing minimum wage to $9 an hour would get it pretty close to the amount it would be if it had kept up with inflation since 1968. It wouldn't quite be there yet. It would not keep up with the living standards, the cost of living that has gone up in that time. But what's more interesting is that if you actually were to account for the increase in productivity that we have created as working people, which means each hour you work, you are producing such and such amount of value, minimum wage would now be over $21 an hour. So that's more than about 70% of this country makes. So that's to give it, and here's a little handy-dandy chart that illustrates this. Going all the way back to 1948, you can see how minimum wage was, there was this magical era between 1948, or mid-1940s, and the early 1970s, maybe even the 1960s, you could say, when things like minimum wage actually kept up with the rate of productivity that that workers were putting out. And we're gonna. So one question that I think we should deal with is why this is happening. The blue line is the real minimum wage in 2012 dollars. The red line is minimum wage if tied to productivity. So while we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 million people unemployed in this country, corporate profits are up 18.6% between the third quarter of 2012 and the year earlier. In 2011, corporations made a record $824 billion in profits. So corporations are now making super profits, but unemployment is barely going up a tad. Our wages are still stagnating. And in addition to all that, everyone is not only working harder, as shown by this graph, and producing more per hour, but they're also working longer hours. So between 2004 and 1973, this is even before the economic crisis, the increase in family average hours worked is the equivalent of adding 5 months of work in a year, which would be the equivalent of 2,080 hours. So if your family, and if you were the average American family in 1973, your family in 2004 would have worked a collective 5 months more per year, in addition to this increasing productivity. And here's just another little chart showing how this is a chart of people who are working 50 hours per week or more. You can see the low-income men, it's going down. That's because unemployment among low-income men is going up, and because they're losing hours and so on and so forth. So these are some of the, this is just the empirical evidence of the crisis of capitalism that we're in right now. So let's start getting into why this all happens, and why this is not just a temporary thing. This is not Obama, it's not Bush, it's not Clinton, it's not Reagan. This is a crisis of the system as a whole, and it's not just in the United States. In fact, in other countries, the crisis they're experiencing is far worse. So these are the two, basically the only fancy concepts I'm going to throw in the entire time, and they're extremely useful. So let's take a moment and think about when someone on the news says, especially maybe in 2008, oh my gosh, we've lost $1 trillion in GDP this year. $1 trillion in value just disappeared, because of the housing bubble bursting or something. What on earth are they talking about? There's no houses were destroyed. There's no, no one has died. The housing bubble. So when they're talking about GDP going up or GDP going down, what they're talking about is exchange value. It's a very abstract thing that we're going to get a little more into. Use value is just what makes everything useful. A house is useful because you can live with it. A shoe is useful because it protects your feet. Food is useful because it gives you nourishment. And in every society, there are use values. The air is a use value. In some societies, there are also exchange values. In earlier non-capitalist societies, there was some trading, so there were some exchange values. In Incan society, there was no trading whatsoever, so there was no exchange value whatsoever. So we know that exchange value is not something that is permanent and eternal. It's very specific to our system, and it has a lot to do with why we're in the kind of crisis that we're in. So here's the kind of trade that I think people tend to think of when they think of trade, and it's almost like a Sesame Street version of trade. You're a farmer, and you grow some extra corn, and you go to market, you sell it for some money. You can see, yes it is. So you sell your corn to get money, and you use that money to buy some boots. And that's trade. Isn't that dandy? Because you didn't make those boots yourself, but now you've got some boots. And that is one aspect of trade. but this is not the kind of trade that there's a little bit more that goes into what goes on into capitalism. In capitalism, the capitalist starts with the money, then they buy a bunch of stuff, they produce a commodity, and they sell it for more money. So they take some money, they get a boot, a boot is created through them spending that money, and then they get more money. And we tend to think about this as like magic or something, like these capitalists make money, that we talk about making money or creating jobs or whatever. But it's not magic, it comes from somewhere. Well, just to skip ahead, it comes from workers. But one of the things you can see about this little diagram here is one of the effects this has in our society, which is this. See, the little dash there is a sign for more money. So you start with some money, create a commodity, sell it for more money, start with some more money, more commodities, more money, and so on and so forth. So you've got, and this has to happen, otherwise you don't invest in production. There's no other way to go about it. And so this is not actually probably how it would work, because you're not going to get 100% profit in most cases, but it's just the easiest way for me to do it. You can see how one of the attributes of capitalism is that it must constantly grow. There is no way out of this. In the environment, and this is, I think, huge. In the environmental movement, people talk about growth policies. They talk about we need to get away from growth. If you want to do that, there's no way you can continue doing capitalism. There's no other way to do it. This is how the profit motive organizes society. And I didn't actually end up making the chart for this, but what is the capitalist spending their money on here? This first $10 and this final $160. What is that going into? It's going into the raw materials for the shoes. It's going into the tools to make them, and it's going to pay workers. The only way this works out is if the workers produce more exchange value than it costs to employ them, which means in the long term they've got to produce more than it costs to keep them alive and keep them reproducing more workers. And how are workers reproduced? Well, they have children and they raise them, and it's or their spouse raises them, and that has a lot to do with the position of women in society as well, and that's something we can go into more as we do this. And there's a couple ways you can prove that all the value that's being created here, all the exchange value, is coming from labor. One thing you can do is take every commodity, break down what cost it took to make it, and you find that each thing that you break down, there's labor behind that. So you take the shoe, you break it down, you've got leather, you've got tools, you've got the workers. You break down the leather, you find more workers. You break down the tools, you find more workers. Until the very end, everything is workers. And so what is exchange value? It's a way of organizing labor. It looks like when we're talking about the economy, we're talking about the organization of things, like the shoe, the dollar bill. But we're actually talking about the organization of people. And that's one of the secrets that you just can't find in the media and in mainstream academic economics. Mainstream economists don't look at this anymore. When the earlier capitalist economists were actually trying to figure out how things were working and wanted to actually learn how to improve the economy, they knew this. They talked about this. Adam Smith talked about this. David Ricardo talked about this. But now economists within the capitalist world, they're all marketing agents for capitalism, so they can't talk about this anymore. It's one of the reasons why they don't understand why crises happen. So that right there is pretty key. So just to really drive the point home, this means that capitalism is fundamentally equivalent to other class societies, like ones that are based on feudalism, slavery, tribute systems, where you have a bunch of people who work and produce stuff, make stuff, and you have other people who don't do anything and basically just command them. And all these societies have their own ways of organizing this and justifying it. So in medieval England, the king had a particular type of clothes he would wear, and it was not just that they were nice clothes. It was illegal for anyone else to wear them because it identified him as the king. And nobility had the same kind of thing going on. The only place you saw other types of you saw these clothes worn by ordinary folk was in plays like in Shakespeare, and that was very regulated. So if you look at our society, well, what's one of the few freedoms of the press you don't have? It's printing money or destroying money. In our society, things like money, land deeds, private property, they're all very important. They're taken very seriously. If you were to wear the king's robe back in England, they'd probably execute you. If you were to print your own $1 billion, you would probably go to jail for a very long time. Unless you already had billions of dollars, in which case they would say, well, you're too structurally important to the economy. But you can see now how it's a way of organizing the society. So on the surface, we're all equal, but those who have more money are more equal. They can get the rest of us to work for them and produce stuff for them and produce a society that they like. Those of us who have no money, extremely vulnerable. You have to work for a living, which means you're basically enslaved to one person or another. You're not enslaved to an individual. You're enslaved to an entire class. You can't run away anywhere. If you go to Europe, well, you're still going to be working for a capitalist in Europe. If you go to Africa, you're working for a capitalist. So you might find some plot of land in Antarctica or something where you can live off of. But generally speaking, they're going to get you one way or the other. And how they got to this point is also very important, because this didn't just happen naturally. It wasn't like people just said, hey, I'm going to give up all my possessions and all my land and I'm going to go work for this guy. It was very deliberate and violent. People had to be forcibly separated from the earth in order to be required to work in order to get those things they needed for survival. So if you look in Europe, one of the first things that Marx actually got interested in when he was a kid in like the 1800s was the fact that there were all these new laws against gathering wood in the forests. Back in the feudal society, you used to be able to gather wood in the nobility's forest and the king's forest. They still had the right to grow stuff there, but you could at least get the dead wood. And you would use that for fuel to keep yourself warm to cook your food. Well, they started outlawing that when Marx was alive, and he got interested in why that was going on. In England, the peasants had these communal areas where they could grow their food together. And the parliament started, and also individual nobility, started saying, no, you can no longer use this common property. It's now this person or that person's private property. And there were people who went around painting their faces black, who were called the blacks, and they would start going into the forests and such and killing animals they weren't supposed to kill, which is a totally new thing. They used to be able to kill these animals for food in the nobles' forest. And this was so threatening to the prevailing order that these whole laws called the Black Acts that had the most vicious punishments. There was almost all death punishments, extremely brutal in public. They'd rip you apart. They'd pour all kinds of awful things on you. And they tried to scare everybody else from doing that. So they were called the Black Acts because they targeted this specific group. In the United States, or I should say in the Americas, when Europe first came here, they didn't have the same kind of land scarcity that people had in England. There was all this land that was being, there was an indigenous population, but they were often friendly to new people coming into their tribes even. And in other cases, they were dying off at a rapid rate because of either war, mostly plague, caused by the Europeans coming. So when the new settlers, especially in the South, tried to get people to work for them as wage workers, and they tried everything, people would run away, and or they would demand really high wages that would produce the profitability. So what did they do? They get slaves, or they enslave people en masse, and they found that it was better to do people who were not native, because if they were native to the land, it was easier for them to run away. They had communities that would protect them. You go to people who are from a different country, they don't look like you. You actually are able to have the entire society police them. And that was how the labor force was organized in this country. It was chattel slavery because of the objective conditions of the land, but in both cases they had to separate people from the land. Now when Reconstruction happens after the Civil War, slaves or people who used to be enslaved are no longer enslaved, and they want land from the people who used to exploit them. And the North did not give it to them. There was brief moments when people started getting land, and then it was taken away. And it's not like there wasn't much land. The land of the richest 70,000 slave owners and the public lands of the ex-Confederate states totaled about 394 million acres. So that's, oops, shoot. Oh well, go back to that. So that amount of land is about, take that back. That's about 1/6 of the United States right there. The amount of land of the wealthiest 70,000 slave owners and the public lands in the hands of the ex-Confederate states. If you wanted to give every former slave, every family, 40 acres and a mule, well, there's 1 million slave families, former slave families. So that's 40 million acres. That's about 1/10 of the land that was available. But that wasn't even all. While they were taking land from ex-Confederates and giving it to Northern capitalists, they were also giving an enormous amount of land to the railroads. How much land did they give to the railroads? It was about that much. It was the equivalent of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, etc. Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, I think Delaware's in there, I don't know. And so they had enormous amounts of land, and they were giving 160 acres to all the white homesteaders who were going west and taking former land of the indigenous population. The reason they couldn't give folks land is the same problem that they couldn't let people take land in the UK, is because of the need to actually keep somebody as as dependent upon working for you, effectively a slave. And they had to do other things as well. They had to form a whole caste system because they needed to keep the profit rate just as high, which is one of the reasons why racism is so integral to the American capitalism. It's not like some sort of accident. It's been integral to the profit rates of capitalists in this country from very early on. And they've changed the way that they get those profit rates, but it's still there today. Now, the white homesteaders I mentioned, they were getting 160 acres, not 40 acres, 160 acres of land. They didn't do so well either, because of railroad charges, freight charges, that is, the control of the marketing in the hands of much larger industrial capitalists, bank mortgages, and various credit issues. The homesteaders were driven out pretty quickly en masse. So they were getting this land all through the mid-1800s. By 1890, 2/3 of the homesteaders had already failed to retain their farms. 1/4 of all farms at that time were operated by tenants, which means they were owned by somebody else, and you were just working there like a sharecropper or a worker of some sort. And and a half of those were outside the South. And 28% of the farms people actually did own were mortgaged. That's by 1890, and we all know this got progressively worse, and now almost nobody owns their own small farm. And actually, I just want to go back to this one picture here. So, I like this cartoonist, Ted Rall. I mean, at least some of his stuff. This is in 1996. The average American had $2 in savings. This is just another way of showing that, one of the things that it shows is that when you work, you are only getting paid to be able to reproduce your ability to exist and have more children. The capitalist gets richer and richer, like that thing we saw earlier, where it just goes up and up and up. But in the long run, we all effectively have nothing beyond what it takes to keep us alive. This is obviously before the housing crisis. This is when people had houses that were worth far more than they are now. So now it's probably more like serious debt. But that's just another proof of that right there. And just furthermore, one other thing about the way that capitalism came about is that not only did it have to forcibly get a labor force, but it had to forcibly open up markets. They had to, Britain, in order to get its first major industrial industry was textiles. And it had to go around the world invading and forcing areas to take their textiles over others. It went to India, went to Africa, went to Latin America, and I didn't get the numbers out for it, but basically they had to force very large sections of the earth, force them to buy their their textiles. In India, they would cut off the thumbs of competing textile workers to prevent them from making textiles because they made much better textiles at the time. But in getting those huge markets, they were able to introduce major innovations that allowed them to reduce the cost and so on of their product. Okay, so just to drive the point home, this ends up with a very extreme concentration of wealth, and this is income disparity right here. This is 2010.
You have to describe it because it's too small to see.
Yeah, okay. So, okay, the big blue thing, that right there is the bottom 90%. See the blue square here? That's the bottom 90%. That's how much income we get on a regular basis. And then this red stripe here is the top 10%, which gets, it gets more than us, but it's the top 10% minus, this little blue square, the top 1%. And then the top 1%, except for the top 0.01%, is this little thing right here, this little square. And you look inside this square, you get the top 0.1%, and they get this yellow circle. And then there's the top 0.01%, and that's their income. It doesn't actually fit on the page there, but you can see.
Jupiter.
And that's income. We're not talking about wealth concentration there, which is important because that's how you invest and that's how you dominate the economy, right? This is a little better at wealth, although it's only 2007 data, and it's probably way off because wealth is a hard thing to calculate. These guys hide a lot of their wealth in sneaky places to avoid taxes and everything. But you can see top 1% gets 34.6% of the wealth in the country. The top 10% controls 2/3 collectively. Bottom 90% gets 26.9, and this is before the crisis where we all lost all this value. They got more money, and they were able to consolidate even further. Here's just another chart so you can see how this actually plays out. The yellow bar is the top 1%, the red is the bottom 90%, and so you can see stocks and mutual funds, even bigger difference. Financial securities, way bigger difference. Business equity, non-income real estate, etc. And again, this is going to be a poor calculation. Okay, I got to be faster here. Oops. Let's just... Okay. So, all right. And then a few other... So just to get another sense of it, that's like proportion one way. If you do it the other way, where you compare the top percentage to the bottom percent, not like the mid layers. So for instance, you take the Walton family, which together is worth $89.5 billion. They've got as much money as the bottom 40% of the country, right? Just those 6 people. And you can do the same thing with Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or what have you. So you can see it's the enormous, that's what's going on there. And as homesteaders lost their farms to large capital, so small businesses continually lose out to big capital, to big corporations. It's inherent in the system. They always come back because there's always new markets that are too risky for big companies to invest in and big bankers to invest in. So they let the little guy go out there and try it out. So that's why they're always encouraging us to do small businesses. Say do it. They just say do a small business. Own whatever. And then you try, and most of us fail when we haven't tried it, but most people who try to do that fail, and they say, oh, those markets are no good. And then the rest succeed. There's a tiny portion. It's like maybe, I don't know what the percentage is, but then they often get bought out, or the company figures, Microsoft or whoever figures out how to destroy those who succeed. And so you get just one really poor number, but at least it gives you some sense. From 2007, again before the crash, you had 69% of, you had 31% of small businesses fail in the first 2 years, 49% in the first 5, and 75% fail in the first 15 years. And when your business fails, it's not like you just go home and party. You often have a lot of debt. It's not a good position to be in usually, not always, but. And a lot of these small businesses, who knows exactly what the numbers are. And there's a lot of talk about the internet, a lot of hoopla about that. But what is the internet? The internet is owned at every level by the largest corporations you can imagine. all the infrastructure, the delivery, the particular spaces from Facebook